I never thought my life was anything extraordinary. It was simple, quiet, routine. I worked at a small local library, surrounded by books, so many books that I felt they were almost a part of me. My days were predictable. I'd open the doors in the morning, assist the regulars who came in for their reading fix, and leave just as the sun started to set. If you had asked anyone who knew me, they'd describe my life as unremarkable, and I'd agree. There wasn't much to stand out. No whirlwind romance, no fast-paced career, just me, my books, and my peaceful existence. But then, everything changed. It's funny how the smallest shifts can turn your entire world upside down. At the time, I didn't know it, but that quiet little life of mine was about to be disrupted in a way that would make all my previous normalcy feel insignificant. When I think back to those days, I realize how much I believed in living under the radar, living just outside the chaos that seemed to consume everyone around me. I didn't need the drama. I didn't need the headlines. I found comfort in my peaceful existence, tucked away in a world of pages and stories. Every day, I read stories about lives that were much bigger than mine, characters who went on adventures, faced enormous challenges, or overcame impossible odds. In some way, I think I started living vicariously through them. It was simpler to stay in my own bubble, where things didn't change much and there was little to worry about. The truth is, I didn't want anything more, at least not until Ethan came into my life. It wasn't some grand romantic gesture that first got me to notice him. No, it was more subtle than that. He wasn't what you would call a smooth talker or some flashy figure who made a dramatic first impression. He was, however, intriguing in his own way. He came into the library like anyone else, asking for a book recommendation. There was something about him, something different from all the others. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when he asked, or the way he smiled when I handed him a book that he clearly hadn't expected. From that moment, things began to shift. What I thought was my quiet, unremarkable life slowly began to change. At first, I wasn't even sure if I wanted it to change. But there was this pull, an invisible force, that seemed to draw me into his world. It was confusing, exciting, and terrifying all at once. And, looking back, I realized how different I felt just being around him. It was like I had been living in a gray world and suddenly, color was being added, bit by bit. Every conversation we had felt like an opening to something new. At first, it was just a small spark, a spark I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. But, as I got to know Ethan more, it became clear, I was no longer living in my quiet, safe world. I was being pulled into something that I couldn't ignore. I had no idea then that what seemed like a harmless connection, an innocent recommendation of a book, would lead me down a path that would challenge everything I knew about myself. But the truth is, when you live a quiet life like I did, you never expect things to get as complicated as they did. Little did I know, my life was about to be turned upside down, and it all started with a simple question: do you think this book is any good? Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything started to change. It wasn't some grand event or dramatic gesture, it was a simple question that Ethan asked me one quiet afternoon at the library. "Do you have a book recommendation?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in the way he looked at me that caught me off guard. I'd given out recommendations plenty of times before, but something about this interaction felt different. I didn't know it then, but that one question was the beginning of everything that would turn my life upside down. At first, it seemed harmless enough. He was just another customer browsing the aisles. But as we talked about books, nothing too deep, just simple, light conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this exchange. Maybe it was his genuine interest in my opinion or the way he listened when I spoke. It wasn't just polite small talk. He seemed interested, not just in the books, but in me. The next few days felt off. My routine was unchanged, but something was stirring inside me. It was subtle at first, a feeling I couldn't quite name. Every time I walked into the library, I found myself hoping he'd show up again, hoping for another chat. The quiet life I'd always known seemed a little less comforting, and I realized it was because I started looking forward to seeing him. Ethan's presence brought a spark that I didn't even know I was missing. One evening, he asked me if I'd like to join him for dinner. It was such a simple offer, but the way he said it made me feel like he wasn't just asking for a casual meal, he was offering something more. Something real. I hesitated. I had always been content with my solitary life, surrounded by my books and the predictable rhythm of my days. But, in that moment, I realized that maybe there was more I wanted. Maybe there was more I needed than the quiet existence I had built for myself. Ethan wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. There was a warmth about him that drew me in, an energy that I couldn't ignore. He wasn't loud or flashy, but his attention to me made me feel seen in a way that was unfamiliar and strangely comforting. We hadn't even had many deep conversations, but he had this way of making everything seem new and exciting. It wasn't just about the books or the dinner, it was about the way he made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just a face in a crowd. The more I got to know Ethan, the more I realized how much he contrasted with the life I had grown so accustomed to. My quiet, solitary world was being slowly pulled apart by his persistence, by his warmth, by the little ways he showed that he cared. And while I wasn't sure what was happening, I couldn't deny that I felt something that hadn't been there before. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. This wasn't just about a simple dinner or another book recommendation. This was about change, about stepping out of my comfort zone and into something completely unexpected. And, if I'm being honest, I was scared. But there was this undeniable pull I couldn't ignore, something that made me want to see where this connection could go. The quiet life I had known was beginning to feel like a distant memory, and the adventure with Ethan, that felt like the beginning of something much bigger than I had ever imagined. I should have known that meeting Ethan's parents wouldn't be as simple as a dinner invitation. When he first mentioned it, I tried to brush off the nerves, telling myself it would be just like meeting anyone else's family, casual, easy. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be just another night out. It felt like a test. And I was terrified I'd fail. When we arrived at their house, I could feel the tension in the air. Ethan, seemingly unfazed, greeted them with the same easy smile he always had, acting as if it was no big deal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being sized up the moment I walked through the door. His parents' cool, polite smiles didn't reach their eyes. I could sense they weren't thrilled to see me. I couldn't even blame them, they didn't know me. But I couldn't help but feel like I was already being judged. Dinner started, and I quickly realized that this wasn't going to be a normal, comfortable evening. The conversation felt forced, awkward, almost like an interrogation. Every question they asked seemed loaded, as if they were trying to figure me out in the span of a few minutes. What do you do for work? How long have you known Ethan? Do you have any family around here? They didn't even try to hide the fact that they were probing, and I felt every second of it. I tried my best to keep it together, to answer their questions as smoothly as possible, but it was hard. With each question, I felt more and more isolated, as if I didn't belong. It wasn't that they were rude, it was the coldness, the lack of warmth that made the whole situation feel so uncomfortable. Their questions weren't about getting to know me, they were about scrutinizing me. And with each passing minute, I became more aware of just how different our worlds were. Ethan sat across from me, as relaxed as ever. He didn't seem bothered by the tension, his casual demeanor only highlighting how out of place I felt. He kept making small comments here and there, but I noticed that he wasn't really engaging in the conversation the way I was. It was as if he didn't even notice how uncomfortable I was, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being left to fend for myself. I thought he would step in, smooth things over, make me feel less alone in the situation. But he didn't. Instead, he sat back, almost like he was watching it all unfold as an outsider. The more I tried to salvage the conversation, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me trying to make a good impression. It was about something deeper, something I couldn't put my finger on. It felt like a test of some sort, not just to win over his parents, but to prove that I was worthy of being a part of their world. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I ever would be. As the dinner wore on, the unease in the room grew. I could see the subtle glances Ethan's parents exchanged, the way they looked at me like they were waiting for me to slip up. It was clear that, to them, I wasn't just another girlfriend. I was a stranger, an outsider, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake that feeling. This was more than just a dinner. It was a defining moment in my relationship with Ethan, and I couldn't help but wonder, if I couldn't win over his parents, what did that mean for us? Would this be the end of what had felt like a blossoming romance? The pressure of their expectations was starting to weigh on me, and the more I thought about it, the more I feared that this might not end the way I'd hoped. Everything changed the moment Ethan brought up the prenuptial agreement. It wasn't something I had expected to come up, let alone become a central point of our relationship. At first, I tried to brush it off as something I could deal with later, but deep down, I knew this was more than just a formality. This was a test. A test of trust, of commitment, and maybe even love. I had always believed that love was something that couldn't be bound by a piece of paper. To me, it was an emotional promise, something that should come from the heart. But when Ethan casually mentioned the prenup, my heart sank. I remember the exact moment. We were sitting in the kitchen, sipping wine, and suddenly he turned to me, looking uncharacteristically serious. He said it was just a precaution, a mere formality, something that people did when they were as successful as we were. It's just a piece of paper, he assured me. It doesn't mean anything. But the word stung. It doesn't mean anything? I wanted to scream. To me, it meant a lot. It meant that Ethan, the man I thought I could trust with my whole heart, was now putting up walls between us. He was questioning everything we had built together. I could see the look in his eyes, the calm, unbothered expression he always wore wasn't reassuring. Instead, it felt like a cold, calculated attempt to protect himself, just in case things didn't work out. What hurt the most wasn't just the prenup itself, but the implications it carried. Was he doubting our future? Was he already planning for a possible end before we had even truly begun? The idea of something so official, so final, being part of our relationship made me feel like I was being treated as a business transaction rather than someone he cared for deeply. I tried to keep my composure, to keep the conversation civil, but inside, my emotions were a whirlwind. How could he not understand the way this made me feel? How could he so casually dismiss my concerns? The trust one had placed in him was being chipped away, piece by piece. I was no longer sure if the man I was falling for was the same one who was now so distant, so guarded. Despite my frustration, Ethan continued to reassure me. He said the agreement was just a formality, something he had to do because of family pressure. It's nothing personal, I swear, he added, as though that would make everything better. But it didn't. His words felt empty, hollow, and I could see the cracks forming between us. How was I supposed to believe in us, in the future we had envisioned, when he was already planning for the worst? The moment the prenup was brought into the equation, everything changed. It wasn't just a legal document anymore. It became a symbol of uncertainty, of doubt, of betrayal. I had trusted Ethan with my heart, but now I was left questioning if he had ever truly trusted me with his. And what made it worse was that I wasn't sure if I could ever see things the same way again. It wasn't long before Ethan's parents started to make their presence felt in our relationship, and I could feel their shadow looming over us more and more. At first, I tried to brush it off. Family is family, after all. But with each passing day, their influence grew stronger and more uncomfortable. It started with small, seemingly innocent comments, but it quickly escalated into something much more pointed, more hurtful. Ethan's mother, in particular, seemed to take an instant disliking to me. The passive-aggressive jabs were subtle at first, but over time, they became impossible to ignore. I remember one dinner where she made a snide remark about how I didn't fit into their circle, as if I wasn't good enough for their son. It felt like a personal attack. And what made it worse was Ethan's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. He didn't even flinch. He didn't stand up for me, didn't say anything to defend me. That silence, that indifference, was what cut the deepest. It wasn't just his mother's cruelty that hurt, it was the fact that Ethan wasn't willing to defend me, his own partner, from this constant barrage. I had always imagined that in a relationship, you'd stand together, face the world together, no matter what. But here we were, and it felt like I was standing alone, fighting battles he didn't even care enough to acknowledge. The more I tried to brush off their interference, the more I realized how deeply it was affecting me. Every interaction with his parents felt like a battle, one I wasn't sure I was winning. And Ethan's inability, or unwillingness, to confront his parents only made the situation worse. I started to wonder if he truly saw me as his equal, or if I was just someone he could placate while keeping the peace with his family. There were moments when I thought it might get better. I thought that maybe, eventually, Ethan would see how hurt I was by his family's treatment and step up to protect me. But instead, I was met with more silence. And with that silence, the distance between us grew. The things I had once admired in him, the quiet strength, the unshakable calm, began to feel like apathy. He wasn't just ignoring his family's cruelty, he was letting it affect our relationship. The tension continued to build, and with it, my frustration. I wasn't sure how much longer I could endure this constant emotional pressure. It felt like I was being pulled in two different directions, the man I loved and the family that seemed determined to tear us apart. The emotional toll this was taking on me was impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at Ethan, I wasn't just seeing the man I had fallen for, I was seeing someone who had allowed his family to disrespect me, someone who wasn't willing to protect the woman he claimed to love. And in that moment, I started to question everything. Was I truly part of his future, or was I just another obstacle to his family's vision of what he should have? It was a normal day when everything shifted. I woke up with sharp stomach pains, nothing too alarming at first, just discomfort I tried to brush off. But as the hours passed, the pain grew unbearable. I knew something was seriously wrong, and I ended up in the emergency room, alone. I remember sitting there in that sterile hospital room, my mind racing, my body in agony, and the silence of the situation only made it worse. What hurt even more than the pain itself was the realization that Ethan wasn't there. Not once did he call. Not once did he check in to see how I was doing, or even send a message. I couldn't stop thinking about how I was sitting there, fighting through the pain, and the one person I thought would care wasn't anywhere to be found. It was like being in the middle of an emotional desert, where no one even noticed how parched I was. I tried to tell myself that maybe he was just busy, maybe he didn't realize the gravity of the situation. But deep down, I knew this was more than just negligence. His silence was deafening. And it hit me hard. The man I had married, the person I thought I could count on, had failed me in my moment of need. I couldn't help but wonder if this was the kind of partner I had signed up for, someone who could go on with life, unaffected, while I was struggling to stay afloat. As I lay in that hospital bed, I had a lot of time to think. How had things gotten here? How had I allowed myself to get to a place where I was depending on someone who couldn't even bother to check on me when I was at my most vulnerable? The isolation I felt in that moment was suffocating. I wasn't just physically alone. Emotionally, I felt completely abandoned. I didn't just need someone to be there. I needed someone who cared, who would show up when things got hard, who would offer comfort when the world felt like it was falling apart. This was a pivotal moment for me, a crisis that I couldn't ignore. It forced me to face the truth. Ethan wasn't the person I thought he was, and our relationship wasn't as strong as I had believed. I had always prided myself on being strong, independent. But this moment made me realize that sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. I wasn't sure if I could keep going like this, constantly holding my breath, waiting for someone who never showed up. And that was when the real question hit me. Was this the life I wanted? Was this the kind of relationship I could continue fighting for? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to make a choice, not just for me, but for my future. Was I willing to keep fighting for someone who couldn't even be bothered to show basic care when I needed it the most? Just when I thought everything in my life was falling apart, something completely unexpected happened. As if the universe had been listening to my struggles, I got a call that would change everything. My great-uncle, whom I had never been close to, had left me a fortune. A substantial inheritance, enough to give me more than just a financial cushion. It was a lifeline. At first, I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Me? Inheriting this amount of money? It felt surreal, almost like a twist from one of those movies where the main character is stuck in a never-ending struggle, only to suddenly find a way out when things seem impossible. But unlike the fairy tales, this wasn't some magical stroke of luck. It was a turning point, a real, tangible opportunity. And in that moment, I realized that this inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about freedom. For so long, I had felt trapped. Trapped in a marriage that seemed more like a cage, trapped by my own fears of being alone, and trapped by the belief that I didn't deserve anything better. But suddenly, I had the means to break free. I had financial independence, something I never imagined I could achieve on my own. It wasn't just about the luxury of a new life, it was about reclaiming control over my own future, the power to make decisions without worrying about the constraints of a toxic relationship. The money wasn't just a practical solution, it was a symbol of something deeper. It was the reminder that sometimes, even when you think you've reached rock bottom, there's still a way out. This was my way out. My great-uncle's unexpected gift had given me the courage to take a step back and reevaluate everything, my marriage, my life choices, and most importantly, myself. I started to feel a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. I wasn't bound by anyone's expectations anymore. I didn't have to stay in a relationship where I wasn't valued, and I didn't have to endure the pressure from Ethan's family. For the first time in ages, I had the chance to chart my own course. And while the future was still uncertain, I now had the tools to shape it. It wasn't just about the financial freedom, it was about realizing my worth. For too long, I had placed my trust in someone who didn't see me for who I truly was, and this inheritance was the catalyst for change. It opened doors to new possibilities, a chance to rebuild my life, and perhaps, in time, heal from the wounds of the past. I didn't know what my next step would be, but the one thing I did know was that I wasn't alone anymore. I had the strength to move forward, and this new chapter, with all its uncertainties, was mine to write.